Montana, Thanksgiving evening, 1952. Crawford Ranch. Snow fell thick outside the windows, the kind of heavy, silent snow that muffled the world and turned everything clean and white. Inside the ranch house, warmth radiated from the stone fireplace where logs crackled and spit sparks up the chimney. The smell of roasted turkey still lingered in the air, mixing with cinnamon and wood smoke. Elderly Emma Crawford Thompson, 76 years old now, sat in the leather chair that had been her father's father's before him. Her hair, once dark as a raven's wing, had gone silver. But her eyes held the same sharp intelligence. They always had the same capacity for seeing what others missed. Her grandchildren, Tommy 12 and Sarah 10, sat cross-legged on the braided rug at her feet. They'd finished their pie, their bellies full of the Thanksgiving feast that had taken all day to prepare. Now came the best part. The stories. "Grandma," Tommy said, fidgeting with the edge of the rug, "Dad said something today I don't understand." Emma smiled, knowing what was coming. Her son had a talent for saying things that required explanation. "What did he say, sweetheart?" "He said great-grandma Maggie wasn't your real mother, that you had a different mother who died. But if that's true, how did you meet great-grandma Maggie?" "Why do you call her your mother?" Sarah leaned forward, her braids swinging. "And Dad said you picked her. How can a kid pick their own mother? That doesn't make sense." Emma's gaze drifted to the window, watching snowflakes spiral down through the darkness. For a moment, she was no longer 76, but 6 years old again, standing in a doorway watching a strange woman with tired eyes unpack a single carpet bag. "It's a long story, children. Are you sure you want to hear it?" "Yes," they chorused together. "Then I'll tell you from the beginning. From the autumn of 1882, when I was exactly your age, Sarah. 6 years old and convinced I was grown enough to make my own decisions." Emma settled deeper into the chair, her voice taking on the cadence of memory. "My father, your great-grandfather Jim, had just placed an advertisement in the Bitter Creek newspaper. He needed a cook, he said, someone to manage the household. We thought we were getting someone to make meals. What we got was everything we'd been missing without knowing we were missing it." She paused, letting the anticipation build. The story starts with blood on her hands, but to understand why that moment mattered so much, you need to know how it all began. The fire popped. Tommy and Sarah waited, barely breathing. Emma closed her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice changed, younger somehow, as if the years were falling away. "Montana, late autumn, 1882. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon." Cut to Montana, October 1882. Crawford Ranch, late afternoon. She knelt in the yard with a child's blood on her hands, and her world changed forever. Margaret Bennett had come to Bitter Creek 3 months earlier with a single carpet bag and secrets she thought she could bury. Now she pressed both hands against Emma Crawford's torn calf, trying to stop the bleeding that seeped between her fingers, no matter how hard she applied pressure. The rusted rake tine had punched clean through boot leather and deep into muscle. The girl's face had gone paper white, her small body shaking with shock and pain. "Don't leave me, Miss Maggie." Emma's voice came out thin and frightened. "Promise you won't leave like the others did." Jim Crawford stood frozen 3 steps away, his face a mask of terror. Ranch hands gathered at a respectful distance, watching their boss's world teeter on the edge of loss again. Old Samuel moved closer, his weathered hand gripping his son's shoulder. Maggie looked down at the child's face, at the trust still there despite the pain, and felt something crack open inside her chest. She'd left everyone. Boston, 3 towns after that, every toe and every chance at belonging. She'd built a life around leaving, around staying separate, around never letting anyone need her this much. But this child had picked her. From the first day, from the first moment, Emma Crawford had looked at her and decided with the absolute certainty only children possess that Maggie Bennett was meant to be her mother. And for the first time in 2 years of running, Maggie chose to stay. "Get her inside," Maggie said, her voice sharp with command. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey, now." 3 months earlier, September 1882, the stagecoach jerked to a stop in a cloud of dust that hung in the air like a question mark. Maggie pressed her palm against the window, feeling the glass warm beneath her touch, despite the autumn chill settling over the Montana territory. Through the grime-streaked pane, she could see Bitter Creek for the first time. A scatter of wooden buildings huddled together as if seeking protection from the vast emptiness surrounding them. It wasn't much. A general store with a sagging porch, a saloon with doors that swung in the wind, A church with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left, as though even God himself was uncertain about this place. The street was more dirt than road, rutted with wagon tracks and littered with evidence of hard living. A few people moved about their business with the kind of weariness that spoke of long winters and longer disappointments. Perfect Maggie thought gathering her carpet bag and the leather satchel that held everything she owned in this world. Perfect because no one would look too closely at a stranger here. Perfect because people who chose to live this far from civilization usually had their own reasons for staying invisible. She'd become an expert at disappearing. 3 towns in 2 years, each one smaller and more remote than the last. Each one farther from Boston, from the accusations from the trial that had ended her old life as surely as a door slammed shut. The jury had acquitted her barely, but the verdict hadn't mattered to people who'd already decided she was guilty. "End of the line, miss." The driver's voice startled her from her thoughts. He was already climbing down, moving to unlatch the door with the efficiency of a man who'd made this journey 1,000 times. Maggie stepped out into the afternoon sun, squinting against the brightness. The air here tasted different, dry and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and something else she couldn't quite name. Distance, maybe. The smell of being far enough of away that the past couldn't follow. "You'll be wanting the hotel." The driver gestured toward a 2-story building that proclaimed itself the Bitter Creek Hotel in faded lettering. "Or are you meeting someone?" "The Crawford Ranch," Maggie said, keeping her voice steady and unremarkable. "I'm the new cook." The driver's eyebrows rose slightly, the first real expression she'd seen on his weathered face. "Crawford Ranch, that's a good 6 miles north. You'll need to hire a wagon." "I can walk." "Not with that bag you can't, and not before sundown." "You'll want to." "I'll manage." Maggie pulled a coin from her pocket and pressed it into his hand before he could argue further. She'd learned that people stopped asking questions when you acted like you knew exactly what you were doing, even when you didn't. Especially when you didn't. She started walking north, following the direction the driver had pointed. The main street gave way to scattered homesteads, then to open grassland that rolled toward distant hills. The bag grew heavier with each step, pulling at her shoulder, but Maggie didn't slow down. She'd walked farther before with less purpose. At least this time she had a destination, a job, a chance to disappear into usefulness until she could figure out her next move. The advertisement had been brief, almost curt. "Remote ranch, room and board, must be reliable and discreet. Apply James Crawford, Bitter Creek." She'd answered by telegram, received an equally brief response with a start date and directions. No questions about her experience, no requests for references, just a job offered to someone who'd been desperate enough to answer. The sun hung lower now, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold. Maggie's feet ached and a blister had formed on her left heel, but she could see buildings in the distance. A barn large and solid, a house with a peaked roof, corrals and outbuildings scattered across property that spoke of more prosperity than she'd expected. The Crawford Ranch wasn't just surviving, it was thriving in a way that seemed almost defiant in this harsh country. She approached slowly, taking in details. The barn had been recently painted the red, still bright and clean. The fences were well maintained, the wood strong and straight. Cattle grazed in the near pasture, healthy animals with thick coats already growing in for winter. Someone was taking care of this place. Someone who had standards. The thought made her nervous. She'd grown accustomed to employers who were too busy or too indifferent to look closely at the help they hired. Standards meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant questions she couldn't answer. The front door of the main house opened before she reached it. A man stepped out onto the porch, tall and lean with shoulders that spoke of hard work and harder winters. He wore dark trousers and a shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. His face had the kind of stillness that came from being more comfortable with silence than with words. "You're late." His voice matched his appearance. Low, rough, economical, with everything including inflection. "I'm exactly on time." Maggie set down her bag, meeting his gaze directly. She'd learned that looking away made people think you had something to hide. "The telegram said to arrive by sundown on the 16th. The sun hasn't set." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or the ghost of amusement. It was gone too quickly to be sure. "You walked from town." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "I did." "Why?" "I chose to." They stood looking at each other, and Maggie felt the weight of his assessment. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 36, maybe less. The lines around his eyes came from squinting into sun and wind, not age. His hair was dark, touched with just enough gray at the temples to suggest he'd earned every year he carried. His hands hanging loose at his sides were scarred and strong, telling stories she couldn't read. "James Crawford," he said finally. "People call me Jim." "Margaret Bennett. Maggie." He nodded once as if confirming something to himself. "You have experience cooking for ranch hands." "I have experience cooking for people who work hard and expect decent food." She kept her voice level, professional. "I can make substantial meals from whatever's available. I don't waste and I don't complain about the hours." "Good, because the hours start at 4 in the morning and end when the work's done. You'll cook 3 meals a day for myself, my daughter, and 4 ranch hands, more during roundup or branding. You'll manage the kitchen supplies, make a weekly list of what's needed, and keep everything clean. You'll have Sundays off after breakfast until evening chores." "Understood. Wages are $15 a month plus room and board. You'll have a room off the kitchen. Door locks from the inside. The men know to keep their distance, but if any of them gives you trouble, you tell me immediately." Maggie nodded oddly, touched by this last detail. He'd said it matter-of-factly without drama, but the message was clear. She would be protected here. It had been a long time since anyone had offered her that kind of safety. "One more thing." Jim's expression hardened slightly, his jaw setting in a way that made him look carved from the same granite as the distant mountains. "I don't tolerate gossip. Don't talk about my business to the hands. Don't carry tales to town. And don't ask questions that aren't your concern. You're here to cook. That's all. That's all I want to do." And she meant it. Simplicity was safety. Anonymity was survival. He studied her for another long moment, and Maggie had the uncomfortable feeling that he saw more than she wanted to show. But finally, he stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. "Come inside. I'll show you your quarters." The house was bigger inside than it appeared from the outside, built with the kind of solid craftsmanship that spoke of permanence and care. The front room held sturdy furniture arranged without fuss, a sofa that showed signs of use, chairs positioned near a large stone fireplace, a desk in the corner stacked with papers and ledgers. Everything was clean but utilitarian, functional rather than decorative. It was also eerily quiet. Maggie had worked in homes before, big ones and small ones, loud ones and lonely ones. This house felt like the latter, as though the silence wasn't just an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, filling every corner and settling over everything like dust. "Kitchen's through here." Jim led her through a doorway into a large room that smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. It was well equipped, a cast iron stove that looked almost new, a sturdy work table in the center, shelves lined with dishes and pots and supplies. A window over the sink looked out toward the barn, and another door led to what appeared to be a pantry. "Your room." He opened a door into the far wall, revealing a small but tidy space. A bed with a thick quilt, a dresser, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a small window with curtains that someone had sewn with more skill than artistry. The door had a bolt on the inside, just as he'd promised. It was more than she'd expected, more than she'd had in some time. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jim nodded, already turning away. "Get settled. Dinner's at 6. I usually make something simple for myself and Emma, but now that you're here, we'll expect a proper meal. Supplies are in the pantry. Use what you need." "Emma is your daughter." "My daughter." He paused, his back still to her. "She's 6. She'll likely come investigate once she realizes you're here. She's curious about everything." There was something in his voice when he spoke of his daughter, a softening, a warmth that transformed him from stone into something more human. It lasted only a moment before he was moving again, his boots heavy on the wooden floor as he headed toward the front door. "Mr. Crawford," Maggie called after him. He stopped, half turning. "We don't stand on formality here. It's just Jim." "Where's Emma now?" "Upstairs napping." He hesitated, then added, "Her mother died 2 years ago. Fever. Emma doesn't remember her well, which is probably for the best. She can be shy with strangers. Don't take it personally." Before Maggie could respond, he was gone, the front door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the quiet house. She stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the silence reshape itself around her, and wondered what exactly she'd walked into. A simple cooking job, she reminded herself. That's all this was. She'd stay long enough to save some money, long enough for the whispers to die down completely back east, and then she'd move on again. She always moved on. It was safer that way. The pantry proved to be well stocked. Flour and cornmeal, dried beans and rice, canned vegetables, and fruit slabs of salted pork hanging from hooks. Someone had been managing the supplies competently, probably Jim himself. She found fresh eggs in a crock, a tin of coffee, a jar of honey, enough to make a respectable meal for tonight and to begin planning for tomorrow. She was pulling out ingredients, already composing a menu in her head when she felt it, the prickle of awareness that came from being watched. Maggie turned slowly, casually, and saw the little girl standing in the kitchen doorway. Emma Crawford was small for 6, delicate in the way of children who'd been sick or sad or both. She wore a simple cotton dress, slightly faded, and her dark hair hung in braids that were coming loose. She had her father's eyes, that same deep brown that seemed to see more than it should, but her face still held the roundness of childhood, the softness that hadn't yet been carved away by hardship. She stared at Maggie without speaking, one hand gripping the doorframe as if she might bolt at any moment. "Hello," Maggie said gently, keeping her voice low and unthreatening. She'd learned that children responded better to calm than to enthusiasm. "You must be Emma." The girl nodded but didn't come closer. "I'm Maggie. I'm going to be cooking here." She turned back to the counter, giving the child space to decide what to do next. "I was just thinking about what to make for dinner. Do you like biscuits?" Another nod, barely perceptible. "Good. I make excellent biscuits. My mother taught me when I was about your age. The secret is not to handle the dough too much. You want to mix it just until it comes together, then pat it out gently." She was measuring flour as she spoke, falling into the familiar rhythm of preparation. "Do you help your father in the kitchen sometimes?" "Sometimes." The voice was so quiet Maggie almost missed it. "I can set the table." "That would be very helpful, thank you." Emma didn't move immediately. She stood in the doorway watching Maggie's hands as they worked, cutting cold butter into the flour, adding buttermilk, bringing the dough together with practiced efficiency. It was only when Maggie began patting out the dough that the girl took a tentative step forward, then another until she was standing at the edge of the work table. "You can come closer if you like," Maggie said, not looking up. "I don't mind company while I work." Emma crept forward until she could see over the edge of the table. Her eyes were wide, tracking every movement. "You're pretty," she said suddenly. Maggie blinked, surprised into a smile. "Thank you. So are you." "My mama was pretty too. Papa has a picture of her upstairs." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, but something flickered across her face. Not quite sadness, more like the memory of an emotion she'd learned to carry. "I don't remember her much, just pieces." "I'm sorry." Maggie cut the biscuits with a water glass, working in smooth, efficient movements. "It must be hard not having her here." "Papa says she's watching from heaven, but I don't feel watched. I don't think people can really watch us from heaven, because if they can, that seems like it would be very boring for them. All they'd do is watch all day." Despite everything, despite the long journey and the aching feet and the weight of starting over again, Maggie laughed. It surprised her, the sound foreign in her own ears. "That's a very practical way of looking at it." "Papa says I think too much." But Emma was smiling now, a small, shy curve of her lips. "Can I help with something? Do you know how to snap beans?" "Yes." Maggie retrieved a basket of green beans from the pantry and set it on the table within Emma's reach. "Snap off both ends and break them in half. Put them in this bowl." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the snap of beans and the crackle of the fire in the stove. Through the window, Maggie could see Jim, in the distance, working with a horse in one of the corrals. He moved with the kind of grace that came from years of practice, his body and the animal communicating in a language she couldn't understand. "Do you have any children?" Emma asked suddenly. "No." "Do you want children?" Maggie paused, her hands still on a biscuit cutter. It was such an innocent question, asked with a child's directness, but it cut deeper than Emma could know. "I haven't thought about it much," she said finally, which was both true and false. She'd stopped letting herself think about futures that included such things. Futures required staying, and staying meant risk. I want a brother or sister, Emma announced, but Papa says it's just us now and that's enough. I think he's sad, though. He gets quiet sometimes and stares at nothing. Children saw too much. Maggie had forgotten that, or maybe she'd never really known it. She'd been raised by people who thought children were miniature adults, expected to behave accordingly, their observations dismissed as childish fancy. But Emma's quiet comment revealed a depth of perception that made Maggie's chest tighten with something uncomfortably close to sympathy. Sometimes people need quiet, she said gently. It doesn't always mean they're sad. Sometimes it just means they're thinking. What do you think Papa thinks about? I couldn't say, but I imagine running a ranch this size requires quite a lot of thinking. Emma considered this, her small hands still working through the beans with surprising efficiency. I think he thinks about Mama and about being alone and about whether he's doing things right. She looked up suddenly, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. Do you think he's doing things right? Maggie felt the full weight of that gaze, the hunger behind it. This child wasn't just making conversation. She was searching for something. Reassurance, maybe, or permission to believe that her small, motherless world was acceptable. I think, Maggie said carefully, that your father is doing the best he knows how, and I think you're very loved. Emma's face transformed, a smile breaking through like sun after rain. I am. Papa tells me every night before bed, even when he's tired, even when he's been working all day and his hands hurt. He always says, Emma girl, you're the best thing in my whole world. Something cracked in Maggie's chest, a fissure in the armor she'd built so carefully. She turned away quickly, busying herself with sliding the biscuits into the oven. That's very nice, she managed. The dinner that evening set the pattern for all the meals that would follow. Maggie served biscuits, golden and steaming beans, cooked with onions and salt pork, fried potatoes crisp at the edges, and a dried apple pie she'd managed to pull together from pantry supplies. It was simple, hearty food, but she'd made it with care, and it showed. Jim ate methodically without comment, but she noticed he took seconds of everything. Emma chattered happily, her earlier shyness evaporated, telling her father about helping with the beans and asking questions about the horses, and reporting that Miss Maggie made excellent biscuits just like she'd promised. Thank you for the meal, Jim said when he finished pushing back his chair. It was good. 2 sentences. Maggie had received more effusive praise for far lesser efforts, but somehow these plain words delivered without flourish felt more genuine than any flowery compliment. You're welcome. He was already moving toward the door, pausing only to ruffle his daughter's hair as he passed. Finish your pie, Emma, then wash up for bed. Yes, Papa. And then he was gone, leaving Maggie alone with the child in the quiet house and the unsettling sense that she'd just witnessed something carefully maintained. A routine, a structure, a way of being that kept everything manageable and safe. Jim Crawford was a man who controlled what he could control, and grief wasn't on that list, so he controlled everything else instead. She understood that better than she wanted to admit. The next morning, Maggie met the 4th member of the household. Old Samuel Crawford appeared at the kitchen door just as she was setting out breakfast for the ranch hands. 68 years old, Jim's father, he lived in a small cabin about 200 yards from the main house. His back was slightly bent from decades of ranch work, his hair completely white, but his eyes were sharp and his hands still steady. He took a seat at the table, nodding to Maggie. So you're the new girl. Heard you make good biscuits. I try my best, sir. Call me Samuel. Somebody calling me Mr. Crawford makes me feel older than I already am. He chuckled softly. Jim said you walked 6 miles from town with that bag of yours. I did. Stubbornness runs strong in you, I see. Good. You'll need it here. He looked at her closely. This little town likes to talk. Has it started yet? Maggie stiffened. I haven't been into town much. Samuel leaned back in his chair. Listen here, girl. I've lived long enough to know people don't walk 6 miles in the sun unless they're running from something or running to something. Which one are you? Both, maybe. He nodded slowly. Honest answer. I appreciate that. He stood up, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder, a paternal gesture. Old man's advice. People are going to judge you. They'll make up stories, decide who you are without knowing a thing about the truth. But only you know what's real about yourself. Hold on to that truth and do what you know is right. The rest will sort itself out. Or it won't, but at least you'll sleep at night. The days fell into a pattern after that. Wake before dawn, feed the men, clean the kitchen, prepare lunch, feed everyone again, clean, prepare dinner, feed, clean. In between, there were pies to bake and bread to knead and supplies to inventory and 1,000 small tasks that kept a household running. It was hard work, physical work that left her tired at the end of each day, but it was also satisfying in a way her previous positions hadn't been. Emma became her constant companion in the kitchen. The girl appeared every afternoon asking to help filling the quiet spaces with her bright, curious presence. She showed Maggie her collection of smooth stones from the creek. She reported on the progress of a bird's nest in the barn. She drew pictures of the ranch, the house, the barn, the horses. And always in the center, 3 stick figures labeled Papa Me and Miss Maggie. Should I add the ranch hands? Emma asked one afternoon, showing Maggie her latest creation. If you'd like. I don't think I will. They're nice, but they're not family. Family is different. She looked up suddenly, her expression serious. You feel like family, Miss Maggie. Do you feel like we're family? Careful. Be careful. I work for your father, sweetheart. I'm here to cook. But you could be more than that. You could... She didn't finish, but Maggie heard the unspoken word anyway. Mother, you could be mother, and that was when Maggie realized the danger she was in. Not from Jim, whose careful distance kept everything professional and contained. Not from the work, which she could manage easily. But from this small, lonely child who was starting to weave dreams around a woman who would inevitably disappoint her. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Maggie found Jim in the barn checking on the horse that had seemed lame earlier. He looked up as she approached, surprise flickering across his face. She so rarely sought him out, keeping to her domain in the kitchen while he moved through his world of animals and land. Is something wrong? He asked, straightening. No, nothing's wrong. I just needed to talk to you about Emma. His expression shuddered immediately, his entire body going still with a wariness she recognized. A father protecting what mattered most. What about her? She's getting attached to me, and I think you should know that I'm not planning to stay permanently. This is a good position, and I'm grateful for it, but I'll likely move on eventually. Maybe in a few months, maybe next year. I don't want her to get too attached to someone who's going to leave. Jim was quiet for so long that Maggie started to wonder if he was going to respond at all. He turned back to the horse, running his hand down its leg, checking for heat or swelling with experienced fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Emma gets attached easily. It's her nature. She wants to love everyone and everything. She wants a mother. I know that. I see it every day. But I can't give her that. I won't marry again. There was something raw in those last words. Something that spoke of wounds that hadn't healed and might never heal. I understand, Maggie said quietly. I just thought you should know. So you can prepare her or explain things, or whatever you think is best. Jim straightened, turning to face her fully. In the dim light of the barn, with shadows pooling in the hollows beneath his cheekbones, he looked older than his years. Tired, carrying weight that no one else could see. I appreciate you telling me, but here's the thing, Miss Bennett. Emma needs what you're giving her, even if it's temporary. She needs to see a woman who's competent and kind. She needs to learn how to cook and clean and manage a household from someone who knows what they're doing. She needs... He trailed off, then started again. She needs normal. She needs to see that life goes on, that not everyone leaves through death, that sometimes people leave because they choose to, because they have their own lives to live. And that's acceptable. That's healthy even. You want her to learn how to let go. I want her to learn that caring about people doesn't always end in devastation. His voice was rough now, emotion breaking through the careful control. I want her to know that it's okay to let people in even if they don't stay forever. That love doesn't require permanence to be real. Maggie stared at him, struck by the complexity of what he was saying, the careful philosophy he'd constructed around his daughter's grief. He wasn't trying to protect Emma from loss. He was trying to teach her how to survive it. That's very wise, she said finally. It's survival. Jim turned away back to the horse, ending the conversation with the same quiet finality he brought to everything else. Thank you for telling me, but don't pull away from her on my account. She'll be fine. We'll both be fine. Maggie left the barn feeling oddly unbalanced, as if the conversation had shifted something she couldn't quite name. She'd expected him to ask her to stay longer, or to keep more distance, or to do something that would make her position clearer. Instead, he'd given her permission to care temporarily, to invest without promising forever, to be present without pretending permanence. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it made her chest ache with a loneliness she usually kept locked away. The weeks passed and autumn deepened into something more serious. The first frost came silvering the grass and painting patterns on the windows. The cattle were moved to winter pastures. The ranch hands built up wood piles and repaired barns and prepared for the cold months ahead. Through it all, Maggie cooked. Stews and roasts and pies, biscuits and cornbread and thick soups that warmed from the inside out. Emma remained her constant companion in the kitchen, growing more confident, more open, more comfortable with each passing day. She told Maggie about her mother in fragments. A smell she remembered. A song. The feeling of being held. She talked about her father with a mixture of love and concern, this tiny girl trying to take care of a man too proud to admit he needed taking care of. "Papa works too hard," Emma announced one afternoon while helping Maggie roll out pie crust. "Mrs. Thornton says he's going to work himself to death, but I told her that was a silly thing to say. You can't die from working, can you?" Maggie paused, choosing her words carefully. "People need rest. Your father is very strong, but even strong people need to take care of themselves. He doesn't sleep well. I hear him walking around at night sometimes, moving through the house like a ghost." Emma pressed her small hands into the dough, mimicking Maggie's movements. "Do you think he's sad? I think he probably misses your mother very much. Do you think he'll ever be happy again? Really happy, not just pretend happy for me?" The question pierced Maggie's heart. She set down her rolling pin and knelt beside Emma, bringing herself to the girl's eye level. "I think that happiness doesn't look the same for everyone. Your father seems content with his work and with you. That might be his kind of happiness right now, and that's okay." Emma studied her face with those two wise eyes. "What about you, Miss Maggie? Are you happy?" Maggie opened her mouth to give the automatic reassurance, then stopped. She'd never been asked that question so directly, with such genuine curiosity. "I'm content," she said finally. "Like your father, I have work I'm good at and a place to sleep and food to eat. That's more than many people have." "But is it enough? Don't you want more? Don't you want—" Emma didn't finish, but Maggie knew what she was asking. "Don't you want a home? Don't you want family? Don't you want to belong?" "Sometimes what we want and what we can have are different things," Maggie admitted, the truth slipping out despite her better judgment. "And that's okay too. We do our best with what we have." It was on a cold Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Maggie's arrival, that the past caught up with her. She'd gone to town alone to collect supplies, her list carefully written, her manner carefully neutral. But she felt the change the moment she stepped into the general store. Mr. Jenkins was polite but wary. Women stopped their conversations when she entered. Eyes followed her through the aisles. Whispers started and stopped as she passed. And Mrs. Harriet Thornton, the town's most prominent widow and leader of the Church Ladies' Auxiliary, crossed the street rather than pass within 10 feet of her. Maggie knew the signs. They knew something. Somehow, despite her caution, despite the distance, despite everything they knew. When she returned to the ranch, Jim was waiting on the porch. His face was grim, and he held a letter in his hand. "We need to talk," he said. He led her into his office, a room she'd never entered before. He closed the door, then turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I received this today, from Mrs. Thornton." He handed her the letter. Maggie's hands shook as she read. Mrs. Thornton had been busy. She'd written to Boston, to the Ashford household, to the towns where Maggie had worked after the trial. She'd gathered information, twisted facts, built a case against a woman she'd never bothered to know. The letter painted Maggie as a thief who'd narrowly escaped conviction, a woman of questionable character, a danger to decent households. "I need to ask you directly." Jim's voice was quiet but firm. "Did you steal from the Ashford family?" This was it, the moment where everything ended, where she would have to pack her single bag and move on again, always running, never safe. She could lie. Had lied before in other towns to other employers. But something in Jim's face stopped her. Maybe it was the directness of his gaze. Maybe it was the memory of Emma's small hand in hers, the trust that had been freely given. Maybe she was just tired of running. No. She met his eyes without flinching. I was accused. My employer lost some valuable jewelry, and suspicion fell on me because I was the newest member of the household staff. I was tried and acquitted. The jury found insufficient evidence to convict, but people decided I was guilty anyway. The verdict didn't matter to them. I became unemployable in Boston and then in every town I tried after that. Someone always heard, someone always spread the story. What really happened that night? Maggie took a deep breath. I was returning a brooch Mrs. Ashford had lent me weeks earlier for a formal dinner. I'd finally located it in my room where it had fallen behind a drawer. The timing was terrible. Midnight. I couldn't sleep, but I wanted to return it before I forgot again. The next morning, jewelry was missing. I was the obvious suspect. My story about returning the brooch sounded weak even to my own ears. Did you do it? No, I swear to you I didn't take anything. But I can't prove my innocence any more than they could prove my guilt. That's the problem with accusations. They stain you whether they're true or not. Jim was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, let him see whatever he needed to see. She'd learned that people would believe what they wanted to believe, regardless of evidence or protestations. If he'd already decided she was guilty, nothing she said would change his mind. My wife died 2 years ago, he said finally, his voice rough. Fever. Came on fast. One day she was fine, the next she was burning up, and within 3 days she was gone. The doctor couldn't do anything. I couldn't do anything. I watched her slip away and He stopped, his jaw working. I held her while she died. And the last thing she said to me was take care of our girl. Not herself, not about the pain or the fear. Just Emma. Always Emma. Maggie didn't know what this had to do with her situation, but she sensed he needed to say it needed her to understand something. After she died, Jim continued, people in town looked at me with pity. They brought food and offered help and said all the right things. But underneath it all, there was judgment. Questions about whether I'd done enough, whether I'd called the doctor soon enough, whether I'd somehow failed her. One woman even suggested that my working so much, being away from the house so often, had somehow contributed, as if grief could be measured in hours spent at home. He looked at Maggie directly now, and she saw pain in his eyes, old and deep and still raw. I learned something then. People need someone to blame when terrible things happen. They need a reason, an explanation, a villain. It makes them feel safer. Like if they just avoid whatever caused the tragedy, they'll be protected. So they create stories, assign guilt past judgment. It has nothing to do with truth. It's about managing their own fear. I'm sorry, Maggie whispered, about your wife, about what people said. I'm telling you this because I understand what it's like to be judged for something you couldn't control, and because I want you to know that I believe you. He set the letter down on his desk, his movements deliberate. I've watched you with Emma. I've watched you work. You're not a thief. I'd stake my ranch on it. The relief that washed through Maggie was so intense it left her shaking. She gripped the edge of his desk, fighting sudden tears. Thank you. You don't know what that means. But, Jim continued, and her heart sank again, you need to know that this will likely get worse before it gets better. Mrs. Thornton is the biggest gossip in 3 counties. If she knows, everyone knows. They'll talk, they'll judge, and some of them will expect me to fire you. Will you? The question came out smaller than she intended. No. Simple. Certain. But I wanted you to be prepared. Town's going to be harder now. They'll watch you. They'll wait for you to make a mistake, any mistake, so they can say they were right about you all along. Maggie nodded, the familiar weight of being watched, being judged, settling back onto her shoulders. She'd carried it before. She could carry it again. I understand. There's one more thing. Jim's expression shifted, becoming almost awkward. Emma doesn't know about any of this. She just knows you as Miss Maggie, who makes good biscuits and lets her help in the kitchen. I'd like to keep it that way. Children don't need to know about the ugly parts of adult life. Of course I wouldn't. She stopped, struck suddenly by the full weight of what he was doing. He wasn't just choosing to keep her employed. He was actively protecting her from gossip, sheltering her from judgment, defending her to a community that had known him his entire life. Why are you doing this? Why risk your reputation for someone you barely know? He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a depth of feeling she hadn't heard from him before. Because everyone deserves a chance to prove who they really are, separate from what people say about them. And because, he paused, then continued more quietly, because Emma is happier now than she's been in 2 years. This house is warmer. It feels less empty. That's worth fighting for. Before Maggie could respond, before she could even process what he'd said, he was moving toward the door, that same efficient motion that seemed to be his default whenever emotion got too close. I'll speak to Mrs. Thornton. Make it clear that you have my full support. It won't stop the talk, but it might limit it. Jim, she called after him. He stopped half-turned. Thank you for believing me. He nodded once, then was gone, leaving Maggie alone in the office with flowers still on her hands and tears on her face and a feeling in her chest that was equal parts gratitude and terror, because she'd told herself this was temporary. She'd promised herself she wouldn't care, wouldn't attach, wouldn't let herself believe in this fragile sense of belonging. But it was already too late. She'd crossed a line somewhere between Emma's sticky-fingered trust and Jim's unexpected defense. She'd started to hope, and hope she'd learned was the most dangerous thing of all. The storm came 3 days later. October in Montana could turn vicious without warning, and this one swept down from the north like a living thing, all howling wind and temperatures that dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Jim and the ranch hands had been moving the last of the cattle to lower pastures when the sky went dark. Maggie stood at the kitchen window with Emma pressed against her side, watching the horizon swallow the riders. The wind rattled the windows in their frames and sent leaves and debris skittering across the yard. They'll be all right, she told Emma, trying to sound confident. Your father knows this land. He'll get everyone home safely. But the hours stretched on. Dinner time came and went. Maggie kept food warm on the stove, checked the window every few minutes, tried to keep Emma distracted with games and stories. It was nearly 8 o'clock when they finally heard horses. Maggie rushed to the door, Emma right behind her. Jim was supporting Tucker Morrison, the lead ranch hand, who was barely conscious. Blood matted the side of Tucker's head, dark and wet despite the rain. The other hands clustered close, their faces grim with worry. What happened? Maggie asked, already moving to help. Horse spooked in the storm. Tucker fell, hit his head on a rock. Jim's voice was tight with controlled fear. That was 2, maybe 3 hours ago. He's been drifting in and out since. Wishram. Get him inside. Lay him on the sofa. I need hot water, clean cloths, and the whiskey from the pantry. Something in her voice, the command and certainty, made everyone move. Within minutes, Tucker was laid out on the sofa and Maggie was kneeling beside him, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Head wounds bled heavily. She knew, but they could also kill. Bleeding on the inside, pressure building. She'd seen it happen once in Boston. A stable boy who'd seemed fine after a fall only to collapse hours later and never wake up. Tucker, she said firmly, touching his face. Tucker, can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Miss Bennett. That's right, I need you to stay awake for me. Can you do that? Tired. I know, but you need to stay awake. She was cleaning the wound as she spoke, her fingers gentle but thorough, checking the skull beneath for fractures. The cut was deep but clean. No bone fragments that she could feel. That was good. Jim, I need you to keep him talking. Don't let him sleep. Ask him questions. Make him answer. Why can't he sleep? Because if there's bleeding inside his skull, sleeping might mean not waking up. She met Jim's eyes, saw understanding and fear flash across his face. He needs to stay awake for at least the next 12 hours. Longer if we can manage it. The night that followed was one of the longest of Maggie's life. She checked Tucker's pupils every hour, watching for the telltale unevenness that would signal pressure building. She monitored his speech, his coordination, the steadiness of his pulse. Jim stayed the whole time sitting across from Tucker, asking endless questions about the ranch, about horses, about anything that would keep the injured man engaged and alert. Emma fell asleep, curled up in a chair, her small face peaceful in slumber, trusting the adults to manage this crisis. Around 2 in the morning, when Tucker's eyes had stayed clear for several hours, and his speech had lost the slurred quality it had earlier, Maggie finally allowed herself to relax slightly. I think he's going to be all right, she said quietly to Jim. But he needs rest now. Real rest. and someone should check on him through the night just to be safe. I'll do it, Jim said immediately. You need sleep too. Let me take the first watch. You can relieve me in a few hours. Jim looked like he might argue, then seemed to recognize the sense in her suggestion. Thank you, Maggie, for knowing what to do, for... He paused, and in the lamplight, she could see the exhaustion and relief warring on his face. Tucker's been with me since the beginning. If something had happened to him, but it didn't, he's going to be fine. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds Tucker's steady breathing and the dying crackle of the fire. Where did you learn all that? Jim asked finally. The medical knowledge. My mother believed in being prepared. She taught me everything she knew about treating injuries and illness. She said a woman never knew when she might be the only thing standing between someone and death, especially out here where doctors are scarce. She taught you well. She did, Maggie smiled sadly. I just never thought I'd actually need it. Jim stood up, moved toward the stairs, then paused. Maggie, yes, you've stopped being just the cook. You know that, right? You've become essential to this household, to Emma, to... He didn't finish, but the weight of the unfinished sentence hung between them. To you, she asked softly. Yes, to me. He met her eyes directly. I realized something tonight when I was riding back with Tucker, bleeding and barely conscious. I realized that the person I most wanted to see, the person I most trusted to handle this crisis was you. Not just because of your medical knowledge, because you're the person I trust with the most important things in my life. Maggie's breath caught. Jim, things are going to change between us, he said quietly. They already have. Is that all right? She should say no. Should remind him she was planning to leave eventually. Should protect them both from the inevitable hurt. Instead, she said, yes, that's all right. Jim nodded once, something like relief crossing his face, then climbed the stairs to check on Emma. Maggie sat alone in the quiet house, keeping watch over Tucker, and felt the last of her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. She'd come here to disappear. Instead, she'd been found. The gossip arrived in Bitter Creek like a winter wind, cold cutting, impossible to ignore. Within days of Jim's conversation with Mrs. Thornton, Maggie felt the change every time she ventured beyond the ranch boundaries. The general store owner, who'd been cordial enough before now, watched her with narrowed eyes as she selected supplies. Women who'd nodded politely now turned away, their skirts rustling with disapproval. Mrs. Thornton herself made a point of crossing the street when she saw Maggie coming, her face pinched with righteous satisfaction. She'd done her work well. The story had spread like wildfire through dry grass. But if the town had turned cold, the ranch remained warm. Tucker Morrison recovered fully within a week, the bruise on his temple fading to yellow-green, his good humor returning along with his health. But he'd taken to stopping by the kitchen more often, always with a word of thanks. You saved my life, Miss Bennett, he said one morning, accepting coffee. Doc couldn't have done better. The boys and me, we appreciate that, and we appreciate how you've been taking care of things here. He paused. Boss seems lighter somehow, less burdened. Haven't seen him like this since before Mrs. Crawford passed. It's good. Man needs someone to share the load with. Maggie didn't know how to respond, so she just refilled his cup and changed the subject. But the words stayed with her. Jim had been alone, she realized. Profoundly, achingly alone, despite being surrounded by people. He'd built walls after Catherine's death, protective barriers that kept grief contained, but also kept connection out. And somehow, without planning to, Maggie had slipped through those walls. She noticed it in small things. The way Jim sought her out more often now, finding reasons to pass through the kitchen, his hand brushing her back as he moved by. The conversations that stretched longer than necessary, both of them lingering over coffee after Emma had gone to bed. Emma noticed, too, her 6-year-old instincts sharp as always. Papa smiles now, she announced one afternoon while helping Maggie knead bread dough. You make him happy, I can tell. Your father has a lot on his mind, sweetheart. The ranch, the cattle, taking care of you. But he's different now. He laughs sometimes. Real laughs. Emma pressed her small hands into the dough. Some of my friends have new mothers now. Their papas got married again, and they seem happy. Do you think Papa could be happy like that? Maggie's heart squeezed tight. Emma. But before she could finish, the sound of horses approaching cut through the quiet morning. Many horses. Through the window, Maggie saw them coming up the drive. A delegation. Mrs. Thornton at the lead, her husband beside her, and three other families behind. The Hayes, the Johnsons, the Andersons. All prominent Bitter Creek citizens, all wearing expressions of grim determination. "Emma," Maggie said quickly, "why don't you go upstairs and work on your drawings for a bit?" "But who are those people?" "I think your father should handle this. Go on now." Emma went reluctantly. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch just as Jim emerged from the barn, his face hardening when he saw the assembled crowd. He moved to stand beside Maggie, a deliberate positioning that spoke volumes. Mr. Anderson spoke first. "Crawford, we need to talk to you about your household situation." "My household is none of your concern," Jim said coldly. "It becomes our concern when it affects the community." Mrs. Thornton stepped forward. "That woman living in your house, unmarried, unchaperoned, except by a child. It's unseemly. It sets a bad example." "Miss Bennett is my employee," Jim said flatly. "She has her own room. She conducts herself with complete propriety. It's more than that, and everyone knows it." Mrs. Thornton's voice rose. "The way you look at her, the way you defend her, you're conducting yourself inappropriately, and it's a scandal." Maggie felt the heat flood her face. "What Miss Bennett and I are or aren't to each other is our business." Jim said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not yours." But it was Mr. Hayes who spoke next, surprising Maggie. "The message that widowers don't need the town's permission to find happiness again. That a woman who's been unjustly judged deserves a second chance." Mrs. Thornton turned on him, startled. "William, a second chance we're willing to offer," Hayes continued, "but only under proper conditions. You need to marry her, Crawford. Make it legitimate. Give that woman a respectable position in this community, and your daughter a proper mother." They weren't here to run Maggie off. They were here to force a proposal. "You're trying to dictate how I run my life," Jim said. "I've never cared what this town thinks, and I'm not starting now." "Think of Emma, Mrs. Johnson said gently. "That child deserves stability. She deserves the security of having a real mother legally and permanently." "Does she?" Mrs. Thornton's smile was sharp. "Or does she have an employee who could leave at any time, a household that exists in a moral gray area? Is that what you want for your daughter?" "Don't you dare," Jim started, but Maggie found her voice. "I don't need anyone to force Mr. Crawford into marrying me. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my life and my future." "Are you?" Mrs. Thornton turned her sharp gaze on Maggie. "Because from where I stand, you're living in a situation that damages your reputation daily." "What's foolish," Maggie said, anger burning away fear, "is thinking you have any right to dictate how two grown adults conduct their relationship. I've spent 2 years being judged by people who didn't know me. I'm done letting other people's opinions dictate my choices. If and when Jim and I decide to marry, it will be because we choose to, not because a group of neighbors showed up demanding it." The silence that followed was profound. It was Mr. Peterson who finally spoke. "That's fair enough. Can't argue with a woman who knows her own mind. Your business is your business, Crawford." Most of the group began moving toward their wagons, but Mrs. Thornton wasn't finished. "This isn't over," she said, her voice bitter. "When Emma is older and trying to find her place in society, when she's judged by the choices her father made, you'll regret not listening to reason." "What I'll regret," Jim said coldly, "is wasting another minute listening to someone who mistakes cruelty for righteousness." "Good day, Mrs. Thornton." He turned his back on her and walked toward the house, his hand finding Maggie's and pulling her with him. The door closed behind them. In the sudden quiet, Maggie could hear Emma stirring upstairs. They'd stood together. They'd faced down the judgment of the entire community, and Jim had held her hand. But before either could speak, a knock came at the door, sharp and official. Jim opened it to find Sheriff Dalton standing on the porch, hat in hand, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Crawford, he said, "I'm sorry about this, but I need to serve you with official notice." He handed over a document. Mrs. Thornton had filed a complaint with the Territorial Child Welfare Office. Questions about Jim's fitness as guardian. Allegations about an unmarried woman of questionable character living in the home. A hearing was scheduled 3 weeks from today. Jim would need to prove the household was appropriate or make changes. The unspoken threat hung in the air. "Marry Maggie." or lose Emma. The days following the sheriff's visit moved in a strange, suspended way. Jim retreated into work with renewed intensity. He was in the barn before dawn and didn't come in until long after dark, exhausted and silent. Maggie understood. He was doing what he always did when faced with something he couldn't control. On the fourth day, Reverend Walsh came to visit. He sat at the kitchen table with Jim while Maggie prepared coffee. "The simplest solution is marriage," Walsh said gently. "If you and Miss Bennett were to marry, the complaint would be moot. The hearing would be canceled. Emma would be safe." "I won't marry under coercion," Jim said flatly. "That's not fair to Maggie or to the commitment marriage should be. Sometimes we have to make practical choices for the sake of those we love. If I marry her, it will be because I choose her, not because Mrs. Thornton demanded it." After Walsh left, Maggie found Jim at the window staring out at the ranch he'd built. "I'll leave," she said quietly. "This is my fault. If I'm gone, the complaint goes away." "No," the word was sharp, final. "Running gives them what they want. We fight this. How buen? We'll go to the hearing. We'll tell the truth. And we'll let a judge decide based on facts, not gossip." Jim turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "I won't let them take her, and I won't let them drive you away." The accident happened on a Tuesday afternoon 1 week before the hearing. Emma was playing in the yard with her dolls. The old garden rake had been left leaning against the fence, its rusted tines pointing upward. Emma, running to show Maggie a flower she'd found, didn't see it. The scream cut through the afternoon like a blade. Maggie and Jim both ran. They found Emma on the ground, blood seeping through her boot, the rake tine having punched clean through the leather and deep into the muscle of her calf. "How deep?" Jim's voice was tight with terror as he scooped his daughter up. Maggie forced herself to be calm. The wound was bad, deep enough to bleed heavily, and rust and soil had been driven into the flesh. Out here, 40 miles from the nearest doctor, that kind of contamination could be a death sentence. Tetanus, lockjaw. "Get her inside," Maggie said. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey. Now." The next hour was one of the worst of Maggie's life. Emma tried to be brave, but the pain was intense. Jim held his daughter, his face twisted with anguish, while Maggie worked with steady hands. The wound had to be thoroughly cleaned. Every speck of rust, every particle of soil had to come out. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Maggie murmured as Emma whimpered. "I know it hurts. You're being so brave." "Make it stop," Emma pleaded. "Please make it stop." Jim was crying too, silent tears tracking down his face as he held his daughter through her pain. "I've got you, Emma. Papa's got you. You're going to be okay." Finally, when the wound was as clean as Maggie could make it, she bound it tightly and stepped back. "She needs to stay off it for at least a week. And we need to watch for signs of infection. Fever, red streaks spreading from the wound, increased pain. If any of those develop, we get her to a doctor." "What are the odds?" Jim asked. Maggie met his eyes, saw the fear there. "If the wound stays clean, good. If I missed any contamination..." She couldn't finish. They kept vigil together that night. Emma fell into restless sleep on the sofa. Jim refused to leave her side. Maggie brought blankets, made coffee, checked the wound every hour. Around midnight, when Emma's breathing had finally evened out, Jim spoke. "Thank you. Again, you keep saving us." "I didn't save her yet. We won't know for days." "Don't." Jim's hand found hers in the darkness. "Don't go to the worst place. She's young, she's strong, she'll fight this." They sat in silence, hands clasped, both watching Emma's small chest rise and fall. "I love her," Maggie whispered finally. "I didn't mean to, but I do." Jim's hand tightened on hers. "I know. I've watched it happen. It's been extraordinary seeing her loved by someone who didn't have to choose it, but did anyway." The fever stayed down. The wound showed clean edges, no angry red spreading. By day 3, Maggie allowed herself to hope. By day 7, she finally let herself believe they'd dodged the worst. The doctor, when they brought him out on day 8, confirmed it. "Finest wound care I've seen outside a hospital." "You saved this child's leg, Miss Bennett. Maybe her life." Some people's opinions began to shift. Women who'd been uncertain now saw a woman who'd saved a child's life with skill and care. Not everyone, but enough. Mrs. Thornton herself only hardened. The day before the hearing, she made her move. Maggie had gone to town for fabric. She walked into the general store to find it crowded with women, Mrs. Thornton at their center. Miss Bennet, Mrs. Thornton's voice was syrupy sweet. How fortunate for you landing such a respectable position after your difficulties back east. If you have something to say, Mrs. Thornton, please say it directly. I've corresponded with people in Boston, made inquiries, and what I learned is that you're not the innocent victim you've portrayed yourself as. You're a woman who was caught and barely escaped prosecution. That's not the full story, Maggie started, but Mrs. Thornton cut her off. You've been moving from town to town one step ahead of your reputation, and now you've managed to ensnare a lonely widower by playing on his daughter's affections. That's enough. Jim's voice came from the doorway deep and cold with fury. She already told me everything, he said, moving to stand beside Maggie. The first week she was here. Every detail, every accusation. She's been honest with me from the start. He turned to address the entire store. Margaret Bennett was falsely accused. She endured a trial that found her innocent. The jury acquitted her, but people decided she was guilty anyway. His gaze swept across the watching faces. She's been honest with me about everything. She gave me every reason not to trust her and let me make my own decision. That's integrity. So here's what's happening, he continued. Margaret and I are getting married. Anyone who wants to celebrate with us is welcome. Anyone who wants to continue judging her based on lies can answer to me. Either way, she's going to be my wife, Emma's mother, and a permanent member of this community. Mrs. Hayes stepped forward. You have my support, both of you, Co. She turned to Mrs. Thornton. And I think you owe Miss Bennet an apology. I will not. Then you should leave, Mrs. Hayes said firmly. Mrs. Thornton gathered her skirts and swept from the store. Several women approached Maggie with quiet words of support. Not everyone, but enough. Walking back to the wagon, Maggie's hands were still trembling. You said we're getting married, she said quietly. You never asked me. Jim stopped right into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. I ordered this 3 weeks ago, before the delegation, before the hearing. I was working up the courage to ask properly. Mrs. Thornton forced my timeline. He turned to face her fully. Margaret Bennett, I love you. Not because the town demands it, not to solve legal problems. I love how you love Emma, how you make this house warm, how you're brave enough to stay when running would be easier. Will you marry me? Not for them, for us. Maggie felt tears streaming down her face. I'm scared, she whispered. So scared of staying, of believing this is real. I know, I'm terrified too, but I'm more scared of not trying. Yes, Maggie said. Yes, I'll marry you, not because Mrs. Thornton thinks we should, but because I love you. I love you both. And I'm tired of running from the only thing that's ever felt like home. They set the date for 1 week later before the hearing. When they returned to the ranch and told Emma, the girl's reaction was everything they could have hoped for. I knew it. Emma launched herself at them both. I knew from the first day I picked you, Miss Maggie, and I was right. Jim laughed, scooping his daughter up carefully. You picked well, Emma girl. And standing there with Jim's arm around her and Emma's joy filling the space, Maggie finally understood what she'd been searching for. Not escape from judgment, not distance from pain. Just this simple, extraordinary gift of belonging. The week before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and quiet joy. Maggie sewed her dress by lamplight, her stitches small and even. She'd chosen blue wool, practical enough for everyday wear, but special enough for a wedding. Jim built a new shelf in what would become their shared bedroom. His hammer strikes rhythmic in the evenings, a promise of permanence being constructed one nail at a time. Emma made decorations from dried flowers and pine branches, determined that everything should be perfect for the day Miss Maggie became her mother for real. Tucker pulled Maggie aside one afternoon, pressing a small wooden box into her hands. Made this for you, for your wedding. Figured every woman should have a place to keep her treasures. The craftsmanship was beautiful, the wood smooth and warm. Tucker, this is wonderful, thank you. 2 days before the wedding, a package arrived from town. Inside was a shawl and soft cream wool from Eleanor Hayes with a note. Every bride deserves something special. What Mrs. Thornton did was wrong, and many of us want you to know we don't share her views. Maggie held the shawl against her chest, overwhelmed by kindness. Old Samuel found Maggie in the kitchen the morning before the wedding. You settling in well, daughter? He asked. It was the first time he'd called her that. I am Samuel, more than I ever thought possible. Good. That boy of mine, he's been half alive these past 2 years. You brought him back to himself. He looked at her directly. You understand what you're taking on. It's not just Jim you're marrying. It's this ranch, this life in a community that's going to watch everything you do. I understand. And you're still willing. I'm still willing, more than willing. I'm grateful. Samuel nodded slowly. Welcome to the Crawford family, Margaret. We're glad to have you. But if the ranch was preparing for celebration, Mrs. Thornton was preparing for war. 5 days before the wedding, Sheriff Dalton returned looking even more uncomfortable. Mrs. Thornton's filed an emergency petition. She's claiming you're rushing into marriage as proof of guilt. The judge has agreed to move the hearing up. It's scheduled for tomorrow at 10. Tomorrow, Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. Either the household is appropriate or it isn't. The judge figures he can determine that in one hearing. After he left, Maggie sank into a chair. She's not going to stop. Let her try. Jim's voice was hard. We go to that hearing tomorrow. We tell the truth, and then we get married the day after, just like we planned. That night, Maggie lay awake. Tomorrow would determine everything. She heard Jim pacing upstairs, unable to sleep either. Maggie made a decision. She climbed the stairs and found Jim sitting in a chair by Emma's door keeping watch. Can't sleep either, he asked. No, he moved over. Maggie settled beside him, their hands finding each other in the darkness. I keep thinking about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong, he admitted. Then let's think about the way it could go right, Maggie said softly. About how the truth is that Emma is thriving. About how we've done nothing wrong except care for each other. Jim was quiet. Then he said, when Catherine died, I thought my life was over. I went through the motions, but I was hollow inside. He turned to look at Maggie. You changed that. You brought warmth back. Laughter. Hope. Jim, let me finish. I need to say this before tomorrow. I love you, Margaret Bennett. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you love my daughter. I love all of it. And whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that. Maggie felt tears sliding down her face. I love you too. They sat like that until dawn, gathering strength for whatever the day would bring. The territorial courthouse was a modest building. Inside it smelled of old paper and accumulated anxiety. Judge Harrison was 60 years old, a circuit judge with a reputation for fairness. Mrs. Thornton sat at the front with her supporters. But on the other side sat Eleanor Hayes, the Johnsons Tucker, and the ranch hands in Old Samuel. Judge Harrison called the hearing to order. This is a petition regarding the fitness of James Crawford as guardian of Emma Crawford. Mrs. Thornton, present your case. Mrs. Thornton stood. She laid out her concerns methodically. An unmarried woman of questionable moral character. Evidence from Boston. The appearance of impropriety. She presented letters, testimony, even brought up that Jim and Maggie announced their marriage only after the complaint was filed. Your Honor, that child deserves better. She deserves a stable environment without the shadow of scandal. Judge Harrison listened impassively. Then he turned to Jim. Mr. Crawford, your response. Your Honor, every allegation is based on gossip, not fact. Miss Bennett was tried and acquitted. She's been honest with me from the beginning. And your relationship with Miss Bennett, we're planning to marry because we love each other. Not because of pressure, but because it's what we choose. Convenient timing, Mrs. Thornton interjected. That's not true, Jim said sharply. I purchased an engagement ring 3 weeks before your delegation showed up. I can provide testimony from the jeweler if necessary. Judge Harrison held up a hand. Tell me about your household. How has Miss Bennett's presence affected your daughter? Jim's expression softened. Emma is happier now than she's been since her mother died. Miss Bennett saved one of my ranch hands when he was injured. She saved Emma's life when my daughter had an accident treating a wound that could have killed her. Miss Bennett has medical training. Her mother taught her practical medicine. The doctor confirmed Miss Bennett's care was excellent. Judge Harrison made notes. I'd like to hear from Miss Bennett herself. Maggie's legs felt weak as she approached. Tell me about the accusations made against you in Boston. Maggie took a deep breath. I was employed by the Ashford family. Mrs. Ashford lost jewelry. I was accused because I'd been seen in her bedroom late at night. The truth is I was returning a brooch she'd lent me. The timing was unfortunate. The next morning, jewelry was missing. I became the obvious suspect. Were you tried? Yes, Your Honor. A jury heard all evidence and found me not guilty. But that verdict didn't clear your name. No, sir. People had already decided I was guilty. I moved to 3 other towns, and each time someone eventually heard. The story would spread until I had to leave again. Why did you come to Bitter Creek? Because it was far enough away that I thought I might disappear. But I'm done running. I didn't steal anything, and I'm tired of being punished for something I didn't do. Why should I believe you? Because the real question isn't what happened in Boston. It's what's happening here with this child. And you can see that for yourself by talking to Emma. The child is 6 years old. The child is perceptive and honest. Ask her if she feels safe. Ask her if I've been anything other than caring. Mrs. Thornton stood. Your Honor, you can't base a decision on a child's testimony. Mrs. Thornton, sit down. Emma Crawford, would you come forward, please? Emma walked to the front, her limp still visible. Hello, Your Honor. Hello, Emma. Do you know why we're all here today? Yes, sir. Mrs. Thornton doesn't think Miss Maggie should live in our house. She thinks it's wrong. And what do you think? Emma considered carefully. I think Miss Maggie is the best person I know. She takes care of me when I'm hurt. She makes Papa smile. She didn't have to love us, but she does. Isn't that what matters? Has Miss Maggie ever done anything to make you feel unsafe? No, sir. Never. She's always kind. She held my hand when my leg hurt so bad I thought I might die. Do you want her to stay? I want her to be my mother. Emma's voice was fierce. I picked her the very first day. Was I wrong? Judge Harrison's expression shifted. No, child. I don't think you were wrong at all. Mrs. Thornton, what concrete evidence do you have that Miss Bennett is unfit? Mrs. Thornton stood, her face flushed. Your Honor, it's about appearances, about proper moral standards. So you have no actual evidence of wrongdoing. I have evidence of poor judgment. Or, Judge Harrison said dryly, you have evidence of 2 adults who found each other and are choosing to build a life together. He looked at her directly. Ma'am, I've been a judge for 23 years. I've seen real abuse, real neglect. This isn't one of them. This is a community busybody who doesn't approve of choices other people are making. Mrs. Thornton's face went white. Your Honor, I can't watch another's child grow up without proper guidance. I can't. Her voice broke. The righteous anger crumbled. My daughter Elizabeth died when she was 6, the same age as Emma. She died 20 years ago, and I watched that child running around thriving, getting a new mother when mine is gone forever, and it's not fair. The courtroom went silent. Judge Harrison's expression softened. Mrs. Thornton, I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but your grief doesn't give you the right to destroy other people's happiness. That child deserves a mother. That man deserves a chance at love again. He straightened. This petition is dismissed. James Crawford retains full custody. I find no evidence of unfitness or danger. Furthermore, I'd be honored to attend your wedding if the invitation still stands. The courtroom erupted. Emma ran to Maggie and Jim. Mrs. Thornton stood frozen, then fled, her husband hurrying after her. It's over, Jim said quietly. It's finally over. No, Maggie corrected, smiling through tears. It's just beginning. The wedding was set for the following Saturday. The morning dawned clear and cold. Emma woke Maggie before dawn, bouncing with excitement. It's today. Can I help you get ready? They turned the preparation into a celebration. Emma brushed Maggie's hair, helped weave it into a simple style with dried flowers. Maggie dressed in her blue wool dress. Eleanor Hayes's shawl completed the outfit. You look beautiful, Emma breathed. Papa's going to forget how to talk. As Maggie walked toward the barn with Emma holding her hand, her heart raced. This was it. The moment where she stopped being Margaret Bennett and became Margaret Crawford. The barn fell silent as she entered. Jim stood at the front beneath the arch, and the look on his face made every moment of fear worth it. You're beautiful, he whispered. Absolutely beautiful. So are you. The ceremony was simple, conducted by Reverend Walsh. But when it came time for personal vows, Jim's voice carried clear and strong. Margaret, when you arrived, I thought I was hiring a cook. I had no idea I was welcoming home the missing piece of my family. You've brought light back to this house, laughter back to Emma's life, and hope back to my heart. I promise to honor you, protect you, stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to love you every day for the rest of my life. Maggie's vision blurred with tears. James, I came running from my past, convinced I could never trust again. You gave me sanctuary. But more than that, you gave me a reason to stop running. You and Emma showed me what family really means. I promise to be the wife you deserve, the mother Emma needs. I promise to choose you every day. I promise to build a home with you where love is stronger than fear. Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, and when Jim kissed her, the barn erupted in cheers. Emma launched herself at them both. You're married, I have a mama now. Maggie scooped the girl up. You do, sweetheart, forever and always. The celebration was joyful and chaotic. People who'd been uncertain now offered genuine congratulations. Eleanor Hayes embraced Maggie. Welcome to the community, Mrs. Crawford. You're one of us now. Late in the afternoon, Mrs. Thornton's husband appeared alone, looking uncomfortable. My wife asked me to convey that she wishes you well. She's not ready to say it herself, but she wanted you to know. Thank you for coming, Jim said. As evening fell, Jim pulled Maggie aside. How are you feeling, Mrs. Crawford? It was the first time he'd used her married name. Overwhelmed, happy, grateful. Is this real? Are we really married? Very real, very married. And there's no escape now. I don't want to escape. For the first time, I want to stay exactly where I am. Good, because I fully intend to keep you here. They stood wrapped in each other's arms while their new life unfolded around them. Later, after guests had departed and Emma had finally fallen asleep, Jim and Maggie stood on the porch looking out over the ranch. What are you thinking? Jim asked. I'm thinking about that first day, when I walked up with my carpet bag, convinced I'd stay a few months before moving on. And now I have everything. She turned to face him. You gave me all of that. No, Jim said firmly. We gave each other that. I was just existing before you came. We saved each other, Margaret. That's what makes this work. I love you, she whispered. I love you and Emma and this life we're building. I love that this is home. I love you too. They stood together in the darkness, the ranch quiet around them. Inside, Emma slept secure in the knowledge that her family was complete. There would still be challenges, harsh winters and difficult seasons, but they would face it all as partners, as the family they'd chosen to become. Margaret Bennett had arrived believing she was there to cook. She thought her job was temporary, her stay brief. She'd been wrong about everything. She hadn't come to work. She'd come home. Emma had known it from the very first day, that sometimes families weren't born, they were built. That sometimes love didn't follow the expected path, but found its way anyway. Come inside, Jim said finally. We have a whole lifetime ahead of us. A whole lifetime, Maggie agreed. The house was warm when they entered. Emma's drawings covered the walls. The kitchen smelled of bread and cinnamon and daily living. It smelled like home. Jim closed the door, sealing them inside their sanctuary. Welcome home, Mrs. Crawford, Jim whispered. Maggie smiled against his chest. Thank you for giving me one. And in that moment, with her husband's arms around her and her daughter safe in bed and the ranch quiet under a blanket of stars, Maggie finally understood what she'd been searching for all along. Not escape, not distance, not constant motion. Just this simple, extraordinary gift of belonging, of being chosen, of choosing in return to stay. Home wasn't something you found, it was something you built one day at a time with people brave enough to risk loving you and strong enough to let you love them back. Epilogue. Spring 1883, Crawford Ranch. The Montana winter had been harsh, but they'd weathered it together. Now spring was arriving in fits and starts. Maggie stood at the kitchen window, watching Jim work with a new colt. Emma sat at the table, carefully copying letters onto her slate. Mama, Emma said, and Maggie's heart still swelled every time she heard that word. Can you help me with this word? Of course, sweetheart. As Emma climbed down and came to stand beside her, Maggie thought about that day when she'd knelt with blood on her hands. The blood hadn't been a stain of guilt. It had been the blood of healing, of choosing to stay and save rather than run. Through the window, Jim looked up and caught her eye. He smiled, that slow, warm smile that was hers alone now, and raised a hand in greeting. Maggie waved back, then turned her attention to Emma and the spelling lesson. The ordinary magic of teaching a child how words were built, letter by letter, just as families were built, choice by choice, day by day. Outside, the Montana sun climbed higher. Inside the house that had once been quiet and empty, there was warmth and laughter and the sound of a mother teaching her daughter. Home. Back to the frame. Montana Thanksgiving, 1952. Elderly Emma finished her story. Tommy and Sarah sat motionless, eyes wide. "So Great-Grandma Maggie really did save you," Sarah said quietly. "She did. She saved all of us in different ways, taught us what it meant to build a family by choice." "And Mrs. Thornton?" Tommy asked. Emma smiled. "She came to apologize eventually. 2 years later. Grandma Maggie forgave her. That's who she was. All heart, all grace, all strength." "Is she here?" Sarah looked around. Emma's eyes grew soft with old sorrow. "She passed 5 years ago, sweetheart. Peacefully in her sleep with your great-grandfather holding her hand. She lived to be 81. She walked to the mantel and picked up a photograph. This was taken on their 50th wedding anniversary. The photograph showed an elderly couple, both silver-haired but still strong. The man had his arm around the woman's waist. The woman was smiling at the camera, but her eyes were on him, full of love that had only deepened with time. "They were married for 54 years, Emma said softly. "And every single day, Grandpa Jim told her he was grateful she'd stayed. And every single day she told him she'd choose him again." Tommy traced the edge of the photograph. "That's a good story, Grandma." "It's a true story," Emma corrected gently. "The best kind. And the lesson is this: home isn't where you start, it's where you choose to stay. Family isn't just who you're born to, it's who you choose to love. And sometimes the people who change your life forever are the ones you almost didn't let in." She returned the photograph to its place. "Now who wants another piece of pie?" Outside, snow continued to fall on the Crawford Ranch, just as it had 70 years before. But inside, warmth and love endured, passed down through generations, a legacy built not on blood alone, but on choice and commitment, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people who decided to stay.